I was told that we have 25 minutes. I just sat down and it says 22 minutes 40, so please correct that. That's not right. And I'm going to go overboard anyway. I think that all of us here are not former soldiers of, but as soon as General Reserves Amos Gilad calls you, you immediately come. And some of you maybe thought this morning, oh no, why did I do that? Why did I say yes? But when Amos asks you to speak, and he asks us to speak about this topic, which I always think is relevant, I remember that Iran was supposed to sign one of the nuclear agreements, and the editor on the Yedioth Ahronoth desk, it was back in 2006, called me up and said, that's it, you're not going to have any more work anymore. I told her, I think the Iranians will be okay and they'll make sure we'll have a lot of work to cover. I think it's just getting worse, actually. But just a little bit about Ukraine for a minute. Until 3 months ago, I would say that in response to the question, when will the war begin between Israel and Iran, I would have said, look, wars in the 21st century are not done with long rows of tanks that are, occupying areas. Now it's a war of shadows, and the war of shadows between Israel and Iran has begun a long time ago, and I think that in the Middle East wars are different these days, and we don't use tanks in order to conquer land. But within this world, this realm, where the Iranian nuclear threat is growing, with Israel targeted in particular, I would like to address these distinguished session members, and I hope that we'll manage to speak without having to kill all of you afterwards. And I would like to go back to those moments that, as published in international media, where Israel, and again we're talking about attacking, was perhaps close to striking Iran between 2010 and 2012. Major General in Reserves Amir Eshel, could you please describe to me that moment in time when you, as one of Israel's commander of Air Force, you were not the Air Force commander yet, but that moment when you thought that Israel was about to strike, or perhaps maybe it was just one of those PR stunts, we were just trying to frighten everyone, as Netanyahu and Barak often did. Well, I'm not here as a photo finish camera to say how close it was. I saw in the media a lot of statements about how close we were to doing that. I think that when it's time for you to be responsible, you don't talk about such assessments. You build the capability, you build the force, because you need to assume that you'll need to use it. And then you do whatever you can in order to make that force relevant on D-Day. And that's what we were engaged in for many years. And I took part in that. I was also the head of the planning division, also I was the commander of the Israeli Air Force, and I think that the more crucial years surrounding this moment was about 10, 12 years ago, between 9 and 12 years ago. That's pretty much the range of the crucial years, and I can tell you one thing. We're not men of theory, we are practical people, we engage in capabilities, not in gambling and bets. And as far as I can say, during those years, there was the capability. We had the capability. It was built over time, and it was suitable for that time and era, but it was not acted upon. When you say capability, we recently heard an interview with the future, actually he is already the IAF commander, and he told Yedioth Ahronoth in an interview that no way will I go to Iran and not carry out this mission. What does it mean to carry it out? What does it mean to succeed? I will say very clearly that these are professional, long processes during which we look at the threat, we look at the achievement, the goal we want to achieve, we look at the capabilities, we build those capabilities in order to meet the required challenge, and then we estimate the achievement. And ultimately, this was a long discourse, a long dialogue in IDF, together with the political echelon for a long time, and ultimately the decision was not made to use this force. And I am saying that now, because I was responsible at the time, the force then was relevant. It could have reached the objective. It was not used for one reason, as far as I understood. We always knew that the military option would be the last one. And in order to use it, you also need to have strategic conditions met. And these strategic conditions, as far as I understood, were not met. And that's why this decision was not made. And it's not because you, as I was once told by the Minister of Defense, then Barak said that the heads of the IDF were worried about the Second Lebanon War traumas, that a war with Hezbollah will begin and you will not know how to reduce its ability to fire, and then the head of the military echelon will be beheaded? No. The Iranian threat was considered very big, and I don't think that the IDF had a problem understanding the severity of the challenge and threat, and perhaps because of this attack there may have been implications. We were all aware of that. It was clear to us all. I had read that you objected to this strike. Well, we were accused of being cowards. I don't want to address those kind of allegations. Around the table are very serious people who understand a lot about use of force and are responsible for it, and are accountable for it, and also for its outcomes. And I don't think I ever saw cowards there. And when you look at the full picture, from the operative tactical capability to the strategic level, I can say once again, the operative capability was there. We had it. But I think the strategic conditions were not met. And now in terms of readiness, it's not that this capability was just set aside and it disappeared. I can say very clearly that the IDF continues and will continue and has continued since to build its capabilities. Of course, the other side, it's not like it stood still. It was also made some progress, and therefore we need to adjust ourselves. We need to make progress and advance. And I can say very clearly that currently the capability to take action in Iran is there. It has not disappeared. It is there. But the other side is posing many challenges, and that is a known fact. Since this government has been set up, there has been a change, and greater emphasis has been placed, including the allocation of resources to force build-up, greater massive forces, more significant and relevant forces. And it's a correlation with the current threat. And we are already in it. He's talking about the current government, and it sounds like you said, like the previous government did not do that. And actually, Netanyahu has been accused of not having approved the jets in time and so on. I don't want to go into this area or another. We have a diverse or a wide range of capabilities in order to really create the operative ability to achieve this goal. And it's not just Iranian nuclear, it is certainly grappling system-wide with these challenges, and this war will be broad, it will be regional. And you said before that the strategic conditions were not met. Let's say tomorrow morning the intelligence comes with the reliable sources tell us that Iranian is breaking toward nuclear. What should be the strategic conditions for Israel to attack? I cannot specify. You're not going to answer me, are you? I am answering. I'm not sure that's what you want to hear. Strategic conditions have to be examined in context, its interests. It is a combination of, let's say, points that ultimately you say this action will achieve the objective it intends to achieve at a price that we're willing to pay, and how do you also get out of it afterwards and exit it afterwards? You have to think before you act, and that's something you need to examine. And since I don't see it happening tomorrow morning, we have to build the capabilities. We have to strengthen it. I'm not saying build, we're actually reinforcing our capability to carry out what needs to be carried out. And it's a very broad spectrum of needs, and to do so in the event that the defense establishment will be required to do that, the IDF. I wanted to ask you what's in your bag and why you're not letting go of it. It's, of course, the key to the submarine. Major General in Reserves Giora Eiland, could you please sum up for us, if you can, in a sentence or two, what is the conflict? What is the Iranian threat? And as far as Israel is concerned, what are the things about Iran's conduct that we should be most worried about? Just briefly about what Amir has said. In September 2012, Prime Minister Netanyahu then thought, and there was logic in his thinking then, that for two reasons this is the window of opportunity for Israel to attack. The first, in terms of the relations of force, it's not just what we can do, but what they are. And because the Iranians had less defense in place, and in terms of their aerial defense as well, and we had greater capabilities, he thought that militarily this would be a good opportunity to take action. But also, politically, he thought September 2012, 2 months before the US elections, politically it would also be the right window of opportunity, because if Israel were to strike Iran, if Iran would do nothing, that would be great, and if Iran would retaliate, then 2 months before the elections in the United States, even if the United States won't like it, it would require it to take action. But that was 10 years ago, so let's move on to the reality. The Americans were also worried that that's exactly what Netanyahu was about to do, and they imagined Israel, and they also saw Israeli UAVs in Iranian skies, and they stopped it. Okay, let's not talk about history, let's talk about what's happening now. In Israel's conduct with Iran, there is currently a conflict, a confrontation. It's not theoretical, it is happening. It is of a low tone, it is usually quite clandestine and quite secret, but there is a tension there that could also erupt, and it could erupt, I would say, in 3.5 arenas, and there's another point on the Gulf that I was going to talk about as well. So what are these 3.5 arenas? One is Lebanon. Ultimately, Iran controls Hezbollah. Hezbollah, to a certain extent, controls Lebanon, despite the disappointing outcomes of elections there as far as Hezbollah is concerned. Hezbollah's military capabilities, we will not specify them here, are remarkable, and therefore it is the most concrete, immediate military threat posed to Israel. In terms of their ability to take action, they don't need much in order for that to happen. And the main question is not just what is this threat, but what are we doing? And one of the things that we are not so good at is to use political levers, and I'm saying that very briefly because I'm also looking at the clock here. Lebanon, as was mentioned before, is in a severe economic and humanitarian crisis that is exacerbating, getting worse. It's not just electricity, just 4 hours a day. It's not just a shortage of product and ATMs not working. It's a real risk of famine, of hunger, of not having enough fuel. And the Israel Monetary Fund and the World Monetary Fund, International Monetary Fund in the United States and Europe are always trying to help, but they want reforms. They want economic reforms in Lebanon, but they're also requiring Lebanon to have less Hezbollah capabilities. And there are many ideas as to which areas. And Hezbollah, I must remind you that it's not ISIS, it's not Al Qaeda, it's not one of those terror organizations that is completely disconnected from the reality and the local politics in which it is living. As far as it's concerned, it is defending Lebanon, it is a political force in Lebanon, it is less popular now, and in France, the United States, the IMF, World Bank will say to Lebanon, whoever Lebanon is in terms of the capability to govern itself, but if they were to say that this is a point that is a condition, a precondition for any aid, and that is for Hezbollah to give up several capabilities, great pressure will be exerted, and that's not something that we're doing well enough. And another thing that I have to say here, and I really want to commend the Israeli leadership, is the Iranian attempt to entrench itself in Syria. And I think the Israeli policy here is not only the right one, but also there is great collaboration, wonderful alignment between the IDF and others, for instance Russia, where you speak little, you do a lot quite effectively, and the reality on the ground right now in Syria is very different from what Qasem Soleimani and others thought it would be, because they meant at this stage, just like they have Hezbollah in Lebanon, they have a second Hezbollah in Syria, and thankfully Iran is far away from that. What is of concern though? that Israel is enjoying a gap of interest between Russia and Iran, and the Russians are smiling every time we strike Iranian targets as long as we don't endanger Assad's regime. I don't know what's going to happen with Russia, of course, with everything that's happening in the Ukraine, and whether the Russians will have less of an impact in Syria, but if they will reduce their aggression or reduce their presence or what they could do in Syria, then obviously it will probably be Iran who will make use of that, and that will be, of course, against us. By the way, in 2005, after Rafiq Hariri died in Lebanon, the world wanted the Syrian forces to leave Lebanon, and I remember there was a discussion headed by Sharon, and we said it's not good for us if Syrians will leave Lebanon, because if they leave, who's going to become stronger? The Iranians, and that's exactly what happened, and it's a lot like what's happening in Syria. And the third point I want to make is the Iranian capabilities to directly attack Israel. They don't want to do that right now, but as we've mentioned, and as the Minister of Defense said, they try every so often. They use UAVs and drones, and their capabilities in this area are remarkable. I'm not talking about Hezbollah, of course, I'm talking about Iranian capabilities, UAVs, drones, cruise missiles, whether it's from Iraq, whether it's from Yemen, whether it's from Iran itself. These capabilities are in place, they are available, and so a scenario that is perhaps unlikely, but it is not impossible, is that on some cloudy Saturday morning at 5 a.m., Israel will be targeted with 30 UAVs and cruise missiles. We have good intelligence, we have good defense systems, we'll be able to manage, but it is a threat, and it's very real. And if Israel will be attacked first, it will be in a completely different place. And it's not theoretical. The Iranians did that just 2 years ago in Saudi Arabia very successfully. So Israel is no Saudi Arabia, but the Iranian capabilities in this area that are constantly improving are certainly something that we are concerned about. And the other half threat is cyber. We only have half the time, too. Okay, so cyber, it's not every time we hear of an attempt to have a cyber attack against systems. Those who do cyber attacks offensively well, they plant the capability and they only use it in later dates. So all of our cyber capabilities, I'm worried there is already an Iranian capability that is planted somewhere. Another final point I want to make, I want to talk a little bit about the Gulf in reference to the last conversation we had. We assume, we want to assume, we like to assume that Israel and the Sunni moderate state are all united against Iran, and that's why we have a front. But that's not necessarily so. I think that Saudi Arabia, particularly in the way that it is managed and in the slightly cynical way of thinking of its leader, if it were to realize the United States, as mentioned before, is physically withdrawing from, but is also not really backing up so much and not really ensuring its support in the event of an Iranian strike, the Saudi Arabians may agree to an Iranian suggestion. They're going to say, you want oil sales to continue, you want commercial activity to carry on. So let's say the Iranians will say, leave the United States alone, leave Israel alone, we'll collaborate, we'll make sure you have, you're able to continue with your commercial activities, and I'm not sure that Saudi Arabia will say no to that. So if we have the support of these countries against Iran, if we think that we have them on our side, I'm not sure that's true for the next few years. Okay, thank you very much. Gideon Frank, what should Israel do now? We keep hearing, and my colleague Muavardi said in the previous session that there are various actions that Israel is taking according to foreign media. So is that what we want? Overt attacks and strikes, as we heard from the Director General? We know that we're preparing. What should Israel do? I think that Iran getting nearer to becoming a nuclear state, even going past the threshold, I think the practical outcome would be that they would be more daring also on the conventional side. So what should Israel do? What it's doing now very well in Syria. We should prepare for a much worse situation because they will be much more daring, they'll be much bolder. Would there be a problem with Russia? We don't know. That's one thing we need to pay attention to. And the other question is whether the Iranians will cross the threshold is very, very complex. As I see it, it's not going to happen. They have two things to lose by that. First, by breaching the NPT, it would mean that their regime would become very similar to North Korea. Iran is not a regime that can continue in a North Korean kind of way. And if Iran would ever think it would have a nuclear weapon and would be able to use it, I'm not sure that's what they think. We need to look at what they think and to be very cautious in that respect. There are some other things that need to be done, and those things that need to be done are when Israel is not at the forefront, but they are more on the diplomatic, political aspect and side of things. I see several main things. First of all, we must explain that Iran that is becoming closer to nuclear is not just an Israeli problem. People talk about it, but we don't take any steps forward. If Iran will become nuclear or be near nuclear, there will be regional results, regional repercussions for Turkey, maybe Algeria. We mustn't forget that. If that were to happen, even if it just becomes near nuclear, if it won't cross the threshold yet, if that were to happen, there'll be potential for destabilization globally of the NPT. And that's very important to emphasize to powers that are a bit complacent about what's happening in Iran, such as China. China, if the NPT and its stability would be questioned, think of Taiwan. Taiwan had a military nuclear program that the United States stopped forcefully. Think about South Korea. South Korea had a military nuclear program that the United States stopped. Japan. Yes, Japan, we know that Japan is just a few steps away. We keep saying 3 months because according to the NPT, when you exit the NPT, you have to give 3 months. So it's not 3 months away from a bomb because they don't have a nuclear level. Yes. And Japan, by the way, says it every so often. I remember at least twice when the Minister of Foreign Affairs in Japan, before he resigned, said Japan should look into and revisit being a member of the NPT. So if you look at it from China's eyes, if the NPT is destabilized as a global regime, so you're saying that Israel should actually convince China or create ties with China so that China will be the one that will force Iran not to get there? Yes, but I don't think we should be at the forefront. Israel should do something, not at the forefront. I don't think we'll be able to do that if we are at the front, but to somehow make sure that progress is made in this area. And another important thing, and again, we shouldn't be at the forefront here. We should take action, but not at the forefront. Look, Iran is currently breaching. There are 4, actually 5 breaches of the NPT. And the NPT is still valid. Iran is a member of the NPT, no matter what happens to JCPOA. They have 4 breaches and another violation from 2015 that was just set aside. That's part of the problem with the JCPOA. And in this regard, we have to take action. Look at what Gross, the Director General of the IAEA, is saying. We have an opportunity to continue to exert pressure on a country that is breaching the NPT, and it's not just an Israeli interest. And in these areas, I think that we're too quiet. Israel has struck twice nuclear project of another country, once in Syria and once in Iraq. And I think that the lesson learned from both of these attacks was positive. Can we conclude from what happened there to what may happen in Iran if Israel should strike? The difference between these 2 targets is huge. First of all, the attack in both was completely justified. Let there be no doubt about that. As for what happened in Syria, once the reactor was demolished. Nothing else happened. There's no other internal capability. So on the one hand, it created a huge intelligence surprise because you can't see the preparation. It suddenly becomes known and disclosed, and thank God we had the Mossad doing a good job. But once you destroyed it, you destroyed it. In Iran, it's a completely different story. Excuse me, in Iraq, it was completely different. The reactor being destroyed was justified, but about 2 years later, 2 years after the Iraqis had given up because they couldn't convince the French to build them a new reactor, they began a uranium enrichment program 2 years later. Thankfully, it was a very stupid program, never mind that, but they had made some progress, and they didn't get anything from Pakistan. They just got the ties to Europe, to Germany, to Switzerland, and they began a very serious program. In 1988, Israel, that knew about that, went to the United States and tried to convince the United States that there is a uranium enrichment program in place that needs to be dealt with, and the United States helped. And thankfully, they occupied Kuwait. Yes, because Iraq occupied Kuwait, it brought upon itself the supervision and the program stopped. Okay, I refused to adhere to all these signs being shown to me that I'm out of time, so I'm going to carry on a little longer. The boss says I can. I think that I want to give you, just to ask you an identical question for all, one that is really at the core of what's happening now with Iran. Giora Eiland, do you think that given that a nuclear agreement is signed, let's say that tomorrow morning, right now they're in dispute, they're in disagreement, but one of the heads of the defense establishment said this agreement has already been signed by the Americans. They're just waiting for the Iranians to sign. They've already decided. So they're just waiting for the Iranians to sign. The Iranians are now saying that the IRGC should be taken off of the terror organization list. Will it be resolved or not? I don't know. Let's assume that tomorrow there is a draft of an agreement that is brought to Israel's attention, and someone thinks that Israel can somehow thwart it. What would be better, an agreement or no agreement? Obviously, this agreement could be approved, but let's say this is it. This is what we can get. What's better, to have an agreement or not? Well, of course, that is choosing between two evils. The best situation for Israel, ironically, is what's happening now, that on the one hand there is no agreement in place, but on the other hand what is expected, and therefore the Iranians are now installing more centrifuges. Yes, but they've been saying that there'll be an agreement for months, but the Iranians are still making progress towards a bomb. Yes, but not as quickly as they would have if it had been the same. They are still preserving this desire to go back to the negotiating table, and therefore this current dragging of heels is really good for us. But if you're asking me in terms of a dichotomous yes or no question, for or against the agreement, the bottom line is yes, I'm in favor of the agreement right now because Israel needs to buy this time, these few years, even if it's only just a few years, to buy this time in order to say, and if we talk about what Professor Litvak said, what's happening in Iran, we also need to improve both our offensive and defensive capabilities, and therefore if the conflict is on the cards, at least it should be a little later, then the nuclear should also be delayed, and some of Iran's conventional capabilities Iran will be more cautious with. So the bottom line would be that regretfully being with an agreement will be better with not having an agreement. And what's very sad is although the actions we took along the way, because I think we made too much noise. Gideon Frank, yes agreement or non agreement? Just very briefly tell me, how is it? Let's say you knew anything about making a bomb. How is it that the Iranians for the last 3 decades have been trying? It's a big, rich country. How is it they're trying to get to a bomb and they don't have one? Don't forget that they stopped their program in 2003 very abruptly. So that's your answer. Are you for or against an agreement? Pretty much the way it is now, or should Israel do everything to stop it? I think it should be looked at strategically. If Israel needs time in order to do something, for instance, to wait for the situation in Iran to exacerbate, then an agreement agreement is better than giving it. How much time will it buy for us? Till about 2031. 8-9 years. Let's say 8 years, which is longer than an attack. And if you attack, if you take the calculation, you have to calculate how long will this strike be valid for. I'm not saying we shouldn't prepare for it, because perhaps the world in these areas is so unpredictable that you also need to prepare for other things. But if your entire objective is to buy time, 8 years is cheaper and less risky than an attack. Lieutenant Major General Reserves Amir Eshel, for or against the agreement? I'm not sure anyone's asking us, but let's assume. I think that our ability to impact this agreement is quite low. I don't know what the agreement is. Depends which agreement we're talking about, as if we know exactly what's in the agreement, but we don't. And I'm saying that very clearly. We want a very aggressive agreement. Of course, that's not what's going to happen. You can speak clearly. There's no press here. So that's the first thing. And in this context, assuming that it would be similar to the previous agreement, we have two issues, assuming that it will be signed. We have two issues that are different. The situation is, if it will be signed, it will be different than it was in 2015. There are more than two issues, but I want to talk about two. The first is that, first of all, this agreement does not buy time. We're using the same clock as the previous agreement, so we actually have less time. That's the first issue. The second issue is we need to look at what's happened in the world in the meantime. And look, if we sign the agreement, or if Iran signs the agreement, it will be very different from what we believed would happen in 2025 in terms of the Iranian economic kind of recovery. That didn't happen in in 2015. I'm not going into the reasons why, but now the situation is different because the world, following the war in Ukraine, is it a new reality with an energy crisis and all the other associated problems. And once Iran will be allowed to go back to the global economy and particularly to exhaust its capability as an energy provider, everyone wants to set Russia aside, and that's going to be a very rapid and meaningful economic boost that will not only impact Iran itself domestically, in the north, in the south of Iran, but a lot of money to keep supporting its proxies, not only in nuclear, but regionally, and that will challenge us far more. But if Iran... No. You're done.
Gideon Frank,
Amir Eshel, Giora Eiland, thank you very much.